every one of us will agree to thank Professor Wistrich for this unique event he organized. Each of us feels alone in this combat, and he gave us the opportunity to discover that we are not alone, or perhaps alone together. Okay, I will give the word to Henry Clemens. Clemens Heine is the director of the Berlin International Center for the Study of Antisemitism and author of 5 books, among them Antisemitism, a Specific Phenomenon. His main fields of research are the New Right and German political culture, the specificity of antisemitism, the uniqueness of the Holocaust, Islamism, jihad and terror, the left and Israel. And his lecture is entitled How Not to Study Antisemitism, Current Trends in Academic Research.
Thank you very much, Shmuel. I want to uplift this a little bit. Okay. Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Robert. Oh, does it work? For this invitation to this conference. I was invited by Robert Wistrich 12 years ago when he was very new as a new head of the center, and of course, there were some troubles when I was giving my talk. I mean, the German embassy was inviting me. I was not a very much pro-German lecturer. However, scholarship is not to make friends, but if you look for the truth, it's not about if you are pro-German or anti-German. I would also like to thank the organizers, because there were some things, for example, the handout was done by the staff very professionally, by Uchama, by Maya, by all the other people from SIGSA, and I also enjoyed their collaboration for 12 years. I was a Felix Posen Fellow, for example, in 2003 and 2004, so there is a wonderful history between this center and myself, and I was honored and happy, for example, to do a book by Robert 3 years ago on Muslim anti-Semitism, one of the most famous brochures written for the American Jewish Committee in 2002, and finally I translated it into German. And it's also interesting maybe for all the other people, because there is a bibliography of his writing from 1973 through 2011, including his German, Hebrew, English, French, and other languages, articles and books. So that's quite impressive. Just to read the bibliography, it takes you some days to understand how deep the knowledge of this phenomenon is. This conference is dedicated to Robert Solomon Wistrich, who just retired as a professor of history at Hebrew University. I mean, I have 3,700 words, so I hope this, I tried, and usually it should be something like 24 minutes, but please forgive me if it will be 2 or maybe 2.5 minutes more. So I will be strict. This is the reason I gave you a handout. So you know, I have an introduction, I have 6 points, and a conclusion. So this is the structure of the following. Robert is best known for demonstrating how to study anti-Semitism, the longest hatred or the lethal obsession, as he frames it precisely. For example, in his book Hitler's Apocalypse from 1985, he argued against those who downplayed the role anti-Semitism and an apocalyptic worldview played in the ideology of Hitler. Why is my talk entitled How to Study, Not to Study Anti-Semitism? Well, in recent years, we have seen an increase in research centers on anti-Semitism. People who never dealt with anti-Semitism in their academic life so far became heads of departments dedicated to the analysis of anti-Semitism. Others invented terms, new terms like group-focused enmity. The Germans invented this term, including the analysis of hostility to new neighbors, sexism, racism, hatred of the homeless, all important topics, okay, but not if this is listed with anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We are facing a tendency, of course, and this has to be acknowledged, and this is important to see, that there is a racism against immigrants all over Europe. I mean, just look into France, the Front National. In Germany, we have similar movements. I mean, I was myself involved in the 1990s, supporting asylum seekers, all kind of people, Muslim from North Africa, Algeria, Morocco, and so on. And 150 immigrants have been killed by neo-Nazis at that time. So we know what we are talking about when we talk about neo-Nazis and racism in Germany. But this had nothing to do with Islamophobia at the time. No one was speaking that we are supporting Muslim refugees. We have been supporting human beings coming from Algeria in particular in the 1990s. In the following, I will try to shed some light on a few particularly remarkable examples in academia and among authors how not to study anti-Semitism. I will deal with liberal or leftist anti-Zionism, as well as, and this will be a surprise for some of you, as well as with conservative or right-wing distortions of anti-Semitism and Nazi Germany, for example. Number one, the case of Arab rejectionism and the binational option. A core aspect of the Arab-Israel conflict is Arab rejectionism of Israel as a Jewish state. Since 1937, when the Arabs rejected the partition plan of the British Peel Commission, they have deliberately been rejecting a Jewish state. Recent scholarship has now discovered how to support Arab rejectionism, the binational option. Instead of analyzing Arab and Islamist anti-Semitism, these scholars focus on Israel and blame the Jews. One example comes from German mainstream scholarship. Christian Wiese, a former Christian priest and now Martin Buber professor for Jewish philosophy of religion at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, is fascinated by the binational option. In 2012, at the University of Sussex in the UK, he accepted a doctoral dissertation by a Romy Lange-Heine about Hans Kohn and the binational option. She portrays Hans Kohn as representing the only ethical type of Zionism, a cultural Zionism that rejects and fights political Zionism and a Jewish state of Israel. In 2006, Professor Wiese wrote an article for the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook. In this article, Wiese goes so far as to quote from Jacqueline Rose's, remember Robert's remarks on this book, he goes so far, and the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook is seen by many as a serious place of publication, right? That's not a New Left Review, that's something serious. So the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook published his article, and in his article he refers to Rose because she deals with Achat Ha'am. Achat Ha'am, I have to, although I have 3,700 words, it's already a lot, so I will include a few more words. But Achat Ha'am wrote a book in German which is called Scheidewege, a 3-volume something like 1990 was published in a third edition, and first edition like 1899. Scheidewege in English is parting ways. So now you can remember why Judith Butler frames her book Parting Ways, for example. So Achat Ha'am, Gershom Scholem, Martin Buber, Hans Kohn and Hannah Arendt, and their opposition to political Zionism. However, Wiese does not analyze the change of Gershom Scholem from a rather cultural Zionist to a political Zionist by the mid-1930s, as I have shown in my latest book on critical theory and Israel. This was published a few weeks ago, and here you see Gershom Scholem on the cover page beside this Adorno and Horkheimer. They are, of course, Marxists, and they have been pro-Israel. There will be a lecture for days to deal with this topic, so I just mentioned this here. But there have been cases of very Marxist, very pro-Israel people. And Professor Wiese quotes from the book The Question of Zion from Jacqueline Rose in his Leo Baeck Institute yearbook article, and he quotes several things from the chapter, page 58 to 107. And in this chapter, I've read this several times, and you will see why. I mean, Robert knows this already, and Arvin Rosenfeld also knows this. However, maybe some of you do not know this yet. In this book, The Question of Sign, on page 64 to 65, Jacqueline Rose writes, I quote, "It was only when Richard Wagner was not playing at a Paris opera that Herzl had any doubts to the truth of his ideas. According to one story, it was the same Paris performance of Wagner music, when, without knowledge or foreknowledge of each other, they were both present on the same evening, that inspired Herzl to write Der Judenstaat and Hitler Mein Kampf." Okay, this could have been at the latest in May 1895, because then Herzl finished his manuscript. At that time, May 1895, Hitler was 6 years old. First time he came to Paris, to France, was in spring and summer 1940 with the Wehrmacht, the German army. Okay, but this was published by Princeton University Press. We are talking about serious publishing houses. I mean, Ivan Rosenfeld dealt with Jacqueline Rose, and Robert dealt with this. It's ridiculous to quote, but I was really astonished that the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook is publishing a professor, a full professor in Germany, who is referring to a very dead chapter where this is published. I mean, Christian Wiese, the very same man, is also the translator of a book called Anti-Semitism, a very short introduction, written by Stephen Beller. The very last paragraph of this book, Beller is known for dealing with Jewry in Austria. The very last paragraph of this book speaks volumes about the ideology of Beller. Quote, "Anti-Semitism," this is published 2007 or so, "Anti-Semitism in the form of a political movement aimed at persecuting, discriminating against, removing, or even exterminating Jews is no longer a major threat in our globalized world." In those terms, the answer to anti-Semitism is ultimately not a Jewish state, but the establishment of a truly global system of liberal pluralism. That's Stephen Beller, translated into German by Christian Wiese. The next point is how not to study anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Holocaust inversion. I mean, Leslie Cleff already dealt just an hour ago with Holocaust inversion in the UK. I have an example from Yale University. Sheila Ben Habib, a famous political scientist professor at Yale University, wrote in 2010, quote, "In the brutal Gaza war, Israel surely," she's a professor of political science, she's very famous, a lot of awards, Sheila Ben Habib. "In the brutal Gaza war, Israel surely committed war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity." Quote end. In 1971, French philosopher and Holocaust survivor Vladimir Yankelevich wrote about forgiving. Yankelevich underscored that when the Germans denied that Jews were human beings, that being itself was denied. This is unprecedented in the history of mankind. During the Gaza war, there were never crimes of that unspeakable dimension, and Sheila Ben Habib should know this. The promotion of universalism and cosmopolitanism has become, in some circles and among liberal scholars and authors, an obstacle to understanding the specificity of Israel as the Jewish state. I have tried to show this in my last book last year, where several examples I referred to in more detail. This is in English, so you can access this, buy the book or read it or whatever. Number 3, the case of post-colonialism, just very shortly, because I'm running out of time already, I think. There is a trend in some parts of historiography to distort Nazi Germany and the Shoah by comparing or equating the Shoah to the history of colonialism. One example is German scholar in African studies Jürgen Zimmerer from Hamburg, who framed the term "from Windhoek to Auschwitz." Windhoek is the capital of southwest Africa, where the Germans were a colonial ruler in the late 19th and early 20th century. This distorts the break of civilization that Auschwitz stands for. Colonialism was based on racism, violence, and sometimes even massacres, as we know. It was a horrible crime what colonialism did, but there was never the intention to kill an entire people. The same critique holds for the equally troubling book Kaiser's Holocaust. It's a book title by David Olusoga and Caspar W. Erickson. Number 4, the case of Holocaust studies. Again, Yale University. Timothy Snyder from Yale was friends with anti-Zionist Tony Judd, who coined the term, quote, "Israel is bad for the Jews," over a decade ago. Most of you know this article, I think. And helped Judd to publish his his last book. In 2012, Chad published a post after he died, was a book published, Thinking the 20th Century, with Timothy Snyder. Snyder became known with his book Bloodlands, 2010, where he includes the Holocaust in a history of mass murder by both Hitler and Stalin. He analyzes a non-existent territory called Bloodlands, from the Baltics to Ukraine and from Poland to Belarus. And for him, it all started in 1932 with the Ukrainian hunger crisis. The Holocaust is just a smaller part of the 14.5 million people who died or were killed by Stalin and Hitler between 1932 and 1945. And the next quote I think is important maybe to listen to, because this quote from the book Bloodlands, it's from Timothy Snyder, is imperative to understand his way of thinking. This is a quote not from the book, but when he's explaining his approach. Quote, it helped that victims of Auschwitz were more likely to be bourgeois, and thus suitable targets of comfortable identification. Much more so, say, than Yiddish-speaking Jewish workers from Poland or Russian-speaking Soviet Jews. But Auschwitz is, in numerical terms, only a fraction of the horror. 5/6 of the Holocaust happened elsewhere and, crucially, earlier. You understand? Auschwitz is not really important to Timothy Snyder. He does not really grasp what kind of break of civilization happened at that very place and other places where Jews were gassed. This shocking quote might be the reason why Snyder is a best-selling author in the world, and that a world that is obsessed to downplay and obfuscate the Shoah and the unprecedented character of the Shoah. For him, it's not unprecedented. I base my analysis of Snyder on international criticism of him by historians Richard Evans, Ephraim Zurow, Jürgen Zarutsky, and Yiddish scholar David Katz, among many others. Particularly Jürgen Zarutsky, he's a German historian in Munich at the Institute for Contemporary History, is the longest and perhaps most detailed analysis of the flaws and scholarly shortcomings of Snyder. And Zarutsky is a real expert on the Holocaust and also Soviet Union. Timothy Snyder argues that Stalin was first, not Hitler. This is exactly the argument of extreme right-wing Ernst Nolte from the Historikerstreit. Armin Rosenfeld will remember this because he dealt a lot with the Historikerstreit in the 80s. And I argue that Timothy Snyder can be considered a grandson of Nolte. Number 5, was Hitler a man of the left? Question mark. Today we can find the ideology that Hitler and Stalin and Putin are equal by a leading German revisionist politician, Erika Steinbach, head of the Federation of German Expellees from the East, who has not too many friends in Poland. Those who are following Germany know that Erika Steinbach has not too many friends in Poland because, for example, until the 1990s, he did not accept the western border of Poland, the Oder-Neisse border. Steinbach is known for equating and comparing Hitler and Stalin, and said that Hitler and the Nazis were socialist and left. So several scholars and authors have rejected this argument in 2012. Steinbach's equation of Putin and Hitler and Stalin is a typical form of post-Auschwitz anti-Semitism. Around 1960, critical theorist Peter Schönbach, who was a co-worker of Adorno, framed it as secondary anti-Semitism. To get rid of German guilt, or even projecting German guilt onto the former victims, like Jews or the Soviet Union, which obviously was a victim of Nazi Germany, has been called by them as a secondary anti-Semitism. And Erika Steinbach is actually a member of the leading body of Angela Merkel's Christian Democratic Union. Others argue in a similar vein and distort Nazi Germany for other reasons. Take Jonah Goldberg as an example. He was the founding editor of National Review Online. He is a columnist for the Los Angeles Times and currently a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. In 2008, I've seen his New York Times #1 bestseller, Liberal Fascism, at an airport bookstore in New York. Goldberg has for sure fine intentions, and he is pro-Israel and pro-American. But for him, Hitler was a man of the left, as one chapter reads. Here is a quote from the promotion for the book on the cover by the publishing house Doubleday, which is a company of world-leading Random House. Quote, "The quintessential liberal fascist isn't an SS stormtrooper. It is a female grad school teacher with an education degree from Brown or Swarthmore." These are two colleges in the United States. This is a trivialization of the Shoah. It can also be read as a typical misogynist or anti-feminist trope. Comparing a female liberal to the SS is not criticism or supposed or real liberal anti-Zionism. This is also not a critique of the supposed or real failure of liberals and the left to deal with jihad and Islamism after 9/11. This is male propaganda. Goldberg has done huge damage to the pro-Israel and anti-Islamism camp in our post-9/11 world. And I know what a post-9/11 world looks like. I have published a book about Islamic studies and anti-Semitism in Germany a few years ago, so I know something about the post-9/11 world and scholarship. The quote from the cover of Goldberg's book also indicates that he has no idea what he's talking about. The term SS stormtrooper is a misnomer. SS stormtroopers did not exist. He confuses SA stormtroopers with the SS. SA means Sturmabteilung or stormtroopers, while SS means Schutzstaffel or protection unit. The SA was essential in the 1920s and early 1930s to fight the left and Jews and to help the Nazis come to power in 1933. After 1934, the SA did not play an important role in Nazi Germany, while the SS became the core organization of the Holocaust. Brandon Sims is a professor in the history of international relations at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge in England. He is also associated with the Henry Jackson Society in London and argues in a similar way as Goldberg. He claims that anti-Semitism was not the core ideology of Hitler. It was just a result of his anti-capitalism. So Sims is about to publish a biography of Hitler in English and German. And I just have a few more minutes, so 5 more minutes. So I will just emphasize, because I've chosen this example because Robert dealt a lot with Hitler in his academic life. And so I just want to mention a few things why it's so outrageous that Hitler was a man of the left, if you have any idea about Austrian or German history in the early 20th century. For example, the funeral of Dr. Karl Lueger, who died in 1910, he was the leading anti-Semite at the beginning of the 20th century, in the late 19th century, in Austria, in Vienna. So the funeral attracted some hundreds of thousands of people in Vienna. Among them was, of course, Adolf Hitler. If Brandon Sims and Jonah Goldberg are saying that anti-capitalism was the core of anti-Semitism, they just became anti-Semites because they hated England, the West, and America, that is not a scholarship. That is just a right-wing propaganda against the very fact that the right was bringing Hitler on power. And Hitler was, of course, a man of the right and not a man of the left. And it's also, and this is even much worse, and this is how not to study anti-Semitism, it is a complete denial, it's bordering to a complete denial of anti-Semitism, what Jonah Goldberg and Brandon Sims and a lot of other people, not only in the United States and England, also in Germany, of course, do, if they say the left is fascist or National Socialist, because it's socialist. I mean, they have no idea what socialist meant. The German way of socialism, for example, I have several pages here dealing with this with quotes, but I have no time, but you can read this next year. The German way of socialism was first of all excluding the Jews from the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community. That was the core of the German socialism. It has nothing to do with socialism in terms of anti-capitalism. I mean, as you all know, the main capitalist companies in Germany were all in favor of Nazi Germany. Take Mercedes as a core example. My last point, how to be pro-Israel and anti-Jewish, is very strange. I just mentioned this at the very end, because some of our left-wing colleagues in Austria and Germany, who do work against Islamism and who are definitely pro-Israel. They say we are pro-Israel and they make rallies in favor of the Jewish state with flags and so. But they got very nasty 2 years ago when there was a discussion about the circumcision. So one of their groups, for example, they urged their followers not to join the first ever German pro-Jewish, pro-circumcision rally in the city of Berlin. So out of the 3.5 million people in Berlin, some 250 joined this rally, some 5 Muslims, some 3 non-Jews, and the rest Jews. So even the pro-Israel lefts, to some degree, have a troubling understanding of the Jewish state. I mean, you can make a joke, they have an understanding perhaps of Israel as being just a Jewish state, because then there are no circumcised men in that country. But that is obviously not the reality. So their view of Judaism is just, I mean, mirroring the mainstream in Europe, which we have seen. Attacks on Judaism and circumcision or Shechtia is not only in small countries like the Netherlands or Norway, but in the leading countries like Germany. And this is, of course, a very troubling tendency. And I think perhaps it's not that much known in Israel. So I mentioned this, that even pro-Israel people detest the circumcision in Judaism. That's the difference to Judith Butler, who is very much pro-Jewish and anti-Israel. And they are pro-Israel, anti-Jewish. So that's very strange, but I mean, that just means that anti-Semitism is such a huge topic, so you can even deal with very, very strange examples. Thank you.
Thank you. It was just in time. And now we'll call to the floor Nelly Lass. She is a senior researcher in Jewish history and women's studies, affiliated with the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism. She published recently in French Voix juives dans le féminisme, Jewish Voices in Feminism, and this book will be translated into English at the University of Nebraska Press. French and Anglo-American Perspectives, French and Anglo Jewish Voices in Feminism, French and Anglo-American Perspectives. And her lecture is entitled Jewish Difference, Antisemitism, and Theories of Gender.
Shomi Motier, ça va? My approach consists in using feminist theories of difference and identity to analyze some aspects of modern Jewish dilemmas, such as Jewish difference, Jewish visibility, separatism, assimilation, anti-Semitism, and solidarity. It is clear that being Jewish is not of the same order as being a woman. Jewish involves cultural, religious, and genealogical dimensions, and the belonging to a community, and more generally to a people. In contrast, the concept of woman, with its biological bias, is not necessarily governed by bonds of loyalty and faithfulness vis-à-vis the female gender in general. The women, who are divided in diverse ethnic and religious groups, don't have a common tradition, a founding Bible. When they are oppressed, it is one by one, in their home, their work, or in the street. This is the reason why it was so difficult to mobilize them as a collective of women. Sisterhood, or solidarity between women, the community of women, was introduced by the feminist movement of the 70s, and it did not take long for its limits to become clear. So the analysis will be totally different for Jews than for women. What can be compared, however, is the way in which people refer to identities. We can find common ground between ways of thinking about sexual identity, misogyny, homosexuality, homophobia, and modes of analyzing Jewish identity, and more specifically, Judeophobia and anti-Semitism. The issue of a Jewish difference, of Jewish invisibility, like that of Jewish power, was one of the standard ground of anti-Semitism. While some criticized the Jews for their separatism, others feared the erasing of this difference and the difficulty of identifying the Jewish difference. Gender theories of difference. The question of difference was raised in many feminist discussions from the 70s to the present time. The universalist feminist approach is based on the declaration that all human beings are equal and that the difference between men and women is simply a power relationship. The specific nature of women is a social construct to justify their subordination as sex objects or as mothers. Since the difference between the sexes is simply a hierarchy of the sexes, these differences must be neutralized as far as possible in order to achieve equality. One of the questions addressed by some Jewish feminists, activists, is whether being Jewish, like being a woman, is a choice or a given. In feminism, the issue of the innate and the acquired is central, especially since the Simone de Beauvoir's famous assertion, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. The differentialist or naturalist approach replies that to be equal does not mean to be identical. There are two distinct sexes with their specific qualities, which do not mean that they are unequal. In order to go beyond masculine domination, it is not necessary to eliminate all differences between the sexes, to become like men. The post-feminist approach, raised by Foucault and Derrida, rejects the gender binarism, which is inevitably hierarchical. No difference between the sexes, but indifference. It was adopted first in America by the queer theory and imported to France recently. Influenced by Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler went further in sexual deconstruction. In other words, we are not born a woman, and we don't necessarily become one. On the general level, this trend is against any identity-based thinking. In the era of globalization, identities are fluid, hybrid, without boundaries. The consequence is the blurring of the frontiers between sexual identities as between cultural and religious identity. Concerning Jews, the postmodern tendency to cultural fusion leads, for example, to the blending of Jewish and Christian traditions in cases such as mixed marriage, the celebration of Christmas and Hanukkah in the same, and the new fashion of wedding where both a reverend and a rabbi bless a mixed union. Now, assimilation, Jewish difference and visibility. Along their history, and in spite of their effort of integration, the Jews were often considered as strangers, infiltrated into the body of the nation. The Jewish difference and their non-difference is related to the notion of otherness, real or fictive. The Jews and the other as a main source of anti-Semitism. Some blame the Jews for their particularism, others will blame the disappearance of this difference. So we find that the modern assimilated Jew, who looks like his non-Jewish neighbors, has not always erased anti-Jewish prejudices. It has even demonstrated historically that it is precisely such Jews who have in part given rise to racial anti-Semitism. Here is the main difference between anti-Semitism and racism. In general, the hate of the foreigners recedes with the disappearance of difference. In the case of anti-Semitism, it sometimes increased with the assimilation of the Jew. Invisibility creates phantasm and an abstract image of the Jew. At diverse periods, there were different attempts to return the Jewish visibility, to mark them as Jews. In Christian and Muslim countries, Jews were required to wear distinct clothing. the yellow badge, the pointed hat, etc. More recently, the Nazis used the yellow star. For the French Jews, this invisibility was a part of their contract with the Republic, a form of condition for their emancipation. It was expressed by the revolutionary Clermont-Tonnerre, who declared, the Jews should be denied everything as a nation, but granted everything as individuals. No separate existence if they want to be citizens. To be a nation within a nation is unacceptable in our country. This Jewish invisibility is still today considered by many French Jews to be a guarantee of equality and supposed to avoid segregation, as historian Pierre Biombon explained. You can read it if you want, but that's okay. Okay? In Western countries where the Jews are integrated, the Jewish difference is often undetectable, apart from when they choose to display their difference by external signs, such as the kippah or a black hat for Orthodox Jewish men. In France, to avoid possible anti-Semitic attacks, religious Jews may swap their kippah for a cap or a beret. In fact, this form of dissimulation becomes their new visibility. The wearing of wigs by Orthodox Jewish women comes probably from similar reasons. In contrast, we have the Muslim who want to be visible by their hijab. It must be remembered that anti-Semitism applies to the visible as well as the non-visible Jew. One is a reminder of the other's existence. French Jews had a bitter experience. During the German occupation, the Statute of the Jews did not make distinction between foreign and assimilated Jews, French Jews. Some reflection on the concept of assimilation. It seems logical to many modern Jews that anti-Semitism would disappear with the disappearance of difference, that invisibility would protect them. In a beautiful text by the French philosopher Vladimir Jankelevich, I am very happy that many quoted Jankelevich, entitled Ressembler, dissembler, resembling, dissembling, 1984, he speaks about a temptation he considers as specific to Jews. The need to look like everybody, to distinguish oneself not at all from the attitude of the majority, from those who surround us, to get lost in them and not to draw their attention. This need to go incognito, which he names the phobia of the difference, is, as he said, a fundamental part of the Jewish existence. Jankelevich points out that while trying to assimilate to the others, the Jewish man feels, however, remorse of the neglected difference because of the infidelity to the Jewish specificity. From this, there is also a need to confirm one's difference. And it is the reason why, he said, we find today among so many Jews the need to be different and the need of a national existence. In the beginning of the 20th century, 1916, the American critic Randolph Bourne, discussing the failure of the melting pot in America, expressed the same observation. He identified as the anomaly of the Jews the feeling of being culturally and racially peculiar. But at the same time, he admitted that the Jews have proven that to be the most assimilable of all races to other and quite alien cultures. This Jewish syndrome, to be like everybody, can be applied to a current debate in Israel since its creation. From outside, as from inside, it is expected or even required to be a different state, not at the others, and if possible, an exemplary state. But at the same time, the aim of its creation was, for a part of its pioneers, to normalize the Jewish existence and to have a country of their own as other nations. In fact, while being inspired by other countries, the State of Israel will develop its own culture and original institutions. It is that form of assimilation that the Zionist thinker Ahad Ha'am considered as positive and even creative. in his famous text entitled Imitation and Assimilation, Rikuy veit bolelut, 1893, he distinguished between a slavish imitation that destroys a culture and a competitive imitation, positive assimilation. For the Jews, he says such productive imitation requires a strong central model, the land of Palestine. Some consequence of assimilation: self-hatred, closeted identity, and Marxism. The long experience of assimilation of Jews, this need to erase Jewish visibility, has given rise to two sorts of attitude: self-hating Jews and Marxism. It is not necessary to develop here the meaning of self-hating Jews. A quote from the feminist historian Gerda Lerner is significant. Living before the rise of Nazism in an assimilated Jewish family in Vienna, Lerner describes her own family's attitude. She notes that self-hatred was a necessary component of assimilation. You can read it's okay? The other consequence of assimilation as a defense against anti-Semitism is the concept of hidden identity, also called Marxism. Marano, as a metaphor, is in fact the principle of the Jewish emancipation, to be Jewish in private and ordinary in the streets. The feminist theorist Eve Sedgwick uses the term closet identity, or coming out the closet, which are well known among homosexuals living in an homophobic society. She gives the example of Queen Esther as a coming out model. This is the point where Esther was to tell her husband, King Ahasuerus, who had just signed a decree for the extermination of the Jews, that she was Jewish. If she had not chosen to reveal that she is Jewish, there was no external sign to distinguish this fact. Some suggest the origin of the name Esther as hidden face, Hester Panim. It seems that Esther was very central among the Marnos Jews. Some of them identified themselves with her strategy of survival, which allowed her to save her life and those of her people. Some consider this form of disguised identity, this Maranic silence in our time, as a betrayal. Others consider it as a justified auto-protection, sometimes necessary. The philosopher Jacques Derrida told that the first time he heard the word Jew was not at home in his family. It was at school in El Biar, Algeria, as an insult, an injury. She joined. Before understanding any of it, I received this word like a blow, a denunciation, a delegitimation, prior to any right, prior to any legality. My relation to Jewishness was deployed in a necessary silence mode, an obstinate silence which protects, or a secret which perhaps keeps from Judaism, but keeps as well certain Jewishness in oneself, here in me, originary accusation for this guilt or responsibility, granted prior any fault or before any act. C'est fini? Tu arrives pas? Non, c'est pas grave. Okay, no problem. Je continue. Even in liberal America, Jews try to escape from their Jewishness. As the feminist Betty Friedan, who grew up before the war in Peoria, Illinois, remembered, I quote, "It has not always been easy to be Jewish in America, especially for those of us growing up in smaller cities like Peoria, where you were very marginal as Jews. There was some kind of an attempt to distance yourself from that painful experience. People changed their names and did something to their nose, tried not to talk with their hands, etc., and denied the very richness, the warmth, and the specialness, the good taste of their own background as Jews." Today, Israel is the only place where Jews don't need to hide themselves as Jews. It was exactly Herzl's dream when he wrote in his diaries, In the promised land, we will be able to walk tall without being jeered for our hooked noses, black or red beard, or bow-legged gait. A country where the Jews would not feel like strangers, stigmatized and caricaturized. There we will finally be able to live as a free people in our own land and die quietly in our homeland. There we will also be granted respect for great achievements. Jewish identity and solidarity. At a time when Jews are integrated among the nations, the concept of identity has become a major concern for Jewish leaders. People talk about assimilation as a decline of Jewish identity, diversity, fractured and hybrid identities. When the borders between groups are perceived as fluid and porous, group integrity is weakened. However, Jewish history has shown that assimilation does not always allow people to escape their origins. Holocaust memory raised the issue of how far Jews can assimilate in other nations, and above all, the impossibility of escaping one's Jewish destiny. And if you refer to a shared destiny, then we also refer to solidarity, responsibility, and unity. Confronted by the Nazis' racial antisemitism, Emmanuel Levinas understood that it was impossible to escape the Jewish condition. Assimilation is an illusion. Being Jewish supposes inassimilable qualities. So we have to rethink, to reinvent Jewish identity after the experience of the Shoah. He used a beautiful expression, in French, is ce virement de la malédiction en exultation, the turning of the curse or the misery into rapture. The Holocaust has reinforced also a need for Jewish continuity, for Jewish survival. If Hitler did not manage to wipe out the entire Jewish people, then the Jewish people must not be allowed to disappear as a result of assimilation. The Jewish state would appear to be a guarantor of the Jewish survival. But for some people, including some Jews, any attachment to the state of Israel looks like sectarianism, a return to the ghetto. For Jean Daniel, it's a Jewish prison, la prison juive. They are required to be universalist, and they are asked to avoid any separateness. They ignore the Jewish tradition of solidarity, which is the oldest and most impressive in modern history. When a British Jew was prepared to travel by land and sea and to extend help to Syrian Jews during the first half of the 19th century, the Damascus affair, it was highly significant. Despite finding themselves divided into diverse nationalities and identities in the wake of emancipation, Jews maintained their involvement with each other. The Alliance Israélite Universelle was set up in Paris in 1860 by French Jews to help the Jews in countries where they suffered from poverty and oppression. It is what Herzl explained to the Jewish Frenchman Narcisse Leven, who claimed that he was first and foremost a Frenchman. Herzl replies to him, "As a French Jew, were you not disturbed when Lueger, a notorious anti-Semite, was elected mayor in Vienna? And should I, as an Austrian Jew, not be disturbed when a French Jew, Dreyfus, was accused of treason in Paris?" At that time, the best expression of solidarity was the establishment of powerful organizations which could lobby for Jewish causes. Yet we have to remember that before the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jews had only their organizations and their philanthropies to help them in time of need. We know today that the best philanthropies and the greatest organizations are not sufficient to prevent persecutions and disaster for Jews. The Holocaust is the most tragic evidence of the limitation of the Jewish organizations. I shall add in this matter a terrible fact which illustrates anti-Semitism motivated precisely by the so-called Jewish solidarity. It happened in France now, in 2006, the kidnapping and the murder of Ilan Halimi, a young French Jew. During 24 days, he was tortured to death. His kidnappers, the gang of the Barbarian, assumed that one of the reasons they chose a Jew was because they were sure that the Jewish community, rich and united, was going to pay the ransom. So besides the classic rational anti-Semitic reasons, we perceive here again the fantasy about the Jews as masters of the world, rich and united, who used to help each other. So this Jewish solidarity, which has been linked to Jewish suffering, can be linked to the phantasm or a supposed Jewish power or Jewish domination. I would like to conclude with the question of feminism and solidarity between women. This solidarity does not have the same motivation as those of the Jews, which are linked to a shared memory, religion, and culture. Sisterhood exists also, even if it's a recent phenomenon. It often crosses nationalities and religions through an international women's mobilization against injustice and oppression against women. It can be universal, but it's also often limited to other belongings, as such ethnic, religious, or familial. The example of religious feminism, Jewish, Muslim, and Christians shows the limits of universal sisterhood. Even if they have the same objective of improving the status of women in their respective faiths, it seems that religion, as nationalism, can be more dividing than unifying for women. Among Jews, as we saw, we can find also unconditional Jewish solidarity, but we find also indifference and even enmity. The most dividing subject is currently Israel and especially its policies. Sometimes being Jewish makes it possible to criticize Israel more easily than non-Jews. This reflection about Jewish difference through theories of sexual difference, radical separatism, universalism, and hybrid identities can be used for analyzing other forms of identities and belongings, not only Jewish. We applied them to the paradox of being Jewish with its existential and historical specificity. The paradox of the universalist Jew who aspires to melt with people around him, but at the same time remains attached to its specificness, visible or invisible. This is one of the main Jewish dilemmas of our modernity, those of acceptance of oneself and that revealing of oneself as a Jew. It is linked with the subject of solidarity, exemplarity, normality, or separatism, universalism, which can contradict or coexist, and which can be, perhaps, a response or a defense against anti-Semitism. Thank you.
And now, Maurice Samuels. He is professor of French at Yale University. He specializes in the literature and culture of 19th century France and Jewish studies. He published The Spectacular Past, Popular History and the Novel in 19th century France, Inventing the Israelite, Jewish Fiction in 19th century France, and he is currently working on a study of the relationship between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism in France from the French Revolution to the present.
So thank you again, Robert, for this kind invitation. I'm very honored. We've heard a lot at this conference about how France is at the epicenter of the new anti-Semitism, and we've also heard a lot about how a certain strain of far-left intellectual in France has done a lot to fuel this new anti-Semitism. Today I want to take a closer look at a specific and troubling feature of the discourse of some of these far-left intellectuals, the way they deploy the concept of universalism to discredit those who denounce the new anti-Semitism, accusing Jews and their advocates of acting out of communitarian impulses when they defend against violence. Now, to accuse someone of communitarianism in France is serious business, because the French public sphere is supposed to be free of ethnic or religious specificity. Communitarianism implicitly conjures the nightmare of an American-style multiculturalism, in which various ethnic or religious groups compete for power and authority, or for sympathy for their past sufferings, which amounts to the same thing in the eyes of those who fear such an ethnic and religious balkanization. To accuse someone of communitarianism, of violating the principles of universalism, is tantamount to accusing them of violating the French Republican social contract. What makes this return of universalism in a certain segment of the far left interesting is its novelty. Since the late 60s, the far left has been much more interested in advocating for the rights of the Third World and for minorities in France than in defending secularism or laïcité. The defense of universalism has been far more common in the center, both center-left and center-right of political discourse in France, including and perhaps especially among those who denounce the new anti-Semitism, such as Alain Finkielkraut and Pierre-André Taguieff. Their concern for Muslim anti-Semitism often accompanies support for laws restricting the wearing of the veil in schools, which many of them see as the sign of a dangerous communitarianism invading the public sphere. It's striking, then, to see far-left apologists for violence against Jews invoke a similar rhetoric of universalism and the same specter of communitarianism as their adversaries. For some of these far-left thinkers, it serves a clearly cynical function. It allows them to accuse their accusers of the same fault for which they are being accused, thus negating the initial accusation. Tariq Ramadan, for example, a Muslim theologian in Switzerland, with whom I'm sure most people here are familiar, published an essay in 2003 entitled Critique of the New Communitarian Intellectuals, which accuses those who denounce the new anti-Semitism of acting out of narrow Jewish interests. I quote Ramadan in my translation. For a few years now, even before the Second Intifada, some French Jewish intellectuals who had previously been considered universalist thinkers began, both on the national and international stages, to develop analyses that are increasingly driven by the communitarian impulse that tends to relativize the defense of the universal principles of equality or justice. End of quote. And Ramadan names names. In addition to Taguieff and Finkielkraut, his principal targets, he includes Bernard-Henri Lévy, Alexandra Adler, Bernard Kouchner, and André Glucksmann. One must admire Ramadan's audacity in accusing his opponents of breaking the rules of French universalism, while himself violating one of its major taboos by categorizing thinkers in terms of their religious or ethnic background. He refers explicitly to his adversaries as French Jewish intellectuals. According to Ramadan, the proof that these Jewish intellectuals, especially Finkielkraut, have betrayed universalism is that they are not neutral on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I quote Ramadan again, "The debate is no longer based on universal principles, and even if he, Finkielkraut, pretends to be linked to the common European tradition, his position taking reveals a communitarianism that falsifies the terms of the debate, in France as well as in regard to Palestine." End of quote. According to Ramadan's logic, the support of these Jewish intellectuals for Israel a priori disqualifies them from taking a position on the subject of anti-Semitism in France, since it skews their perspective in this and presumably all matters. Ramadan's reasoning seems to be that these Jewish intellectuals have allowed their Jewishness to determine their opinions, negating their truth value and betraying the pretense to objectivity required of the universalist intellectual. Now, I've been putting Jewish in quotation marks because, since one of his primary examples, Taguieff, is not actually Jewish, Ramadan's entire line of reasoning would seem to be invalidated if it weren't already invalidated by his blatant hypocrisy in pretending to be any less communitarian than those he accuses. The same accusation that the Jews are not sufficiently universalist can be found in a more subtle leftist thinker, Yvon Segret, an Israeli philosopher and student of Alain Badiou, about whom more below, who has written several books in French devoted to unmasking what he labels the new philo-Semitic discourse in France, apparently any discourse that denounces anti-Semitism, defends Israel, or makes reference to Auschwitz. Segret's targets are the same as Ramadan's, Taguieff, Finkielkraut, BHL, etc. But while Ramadan accuses these Jewish thinkers of betraying universalism because they support Israel, Segret sees them as agents of a different and far more nefarious occult power, the United States. In La réaction philosémite ou la trahison des clercs, so the philo-Semitic reaction or the treason of the intellectuals of 2009, Segret denounces all discussion of anti-Semitism as a, quote, vast ideological operation aiming to impose as its watchword a defense of the West, end of quote. For Segret, Israel is merely a second-tier player in this much broader cultural and political war of reaction against the residue of 1968 and the interests of the Third World. Nothing much new here. What interests me in Segret is that, like Ramadan, he accuses his enemies, the French intellectuals he labels philo-Semitic, of violating universalism. Hence the echo in Segret's title of Julien Bonda's La trahison des clercs, Treason of the Intellectuals, of 1927, which argued famously that French intellectuals of the Belle Époque betrayed universalism by encouraging racist nationalism. Segret explains that he does not mean to label the new philo-Semites partisans of a Jewish particularism, but rather to denounce them for violating or betraying the spirit of Judaism in their subservience to Western imperialism. Segret follows a similar line of reasoning in his other book, Qu'appelle-t-on penser Auschwitz? What does one call thinking Auschwitz? Also published in 2009, which attempts to demonstrate how Jewish thinkers, many of the same ones who theorize anti-Semitism, have manipulated Holocaust memory for similarly reactionary Western imperialist ends. The Auschwitz book bears a preface by Alain Badiou, Segret's teacher, and he's going to be my real subject here. As we'll see, his embrace of universalism is of a different order, at once more philosophical and more political in a way that seeks to transcend the limits of the Republican model of universalism, which Badiou sees as bourgeois capitalist and hence not truly universal at all. Over the past several decades or so, or decade, I would say, Badiou's star has risen to surprising heights in the academy, where he is known mainly as a theorist of the event, of subjectivity, and of aesthetics, and where his most radical essays on Jewish issues are only beginning to be translated. In his preface to Segret's book, Badiou refers to the philo-Semitism of those intellectuals who denounce Muslim violence against Jews as a dangerous provocation. These professional philo-Semites, he says, have proclaimed themselves, I quote, the unique public defenders of the rights of man, of ethics, of democracy, and of Western civilization, end of quote. But all the supposedly universalist values they make a show of defending serve, according to Badiou, as a mere smokescreen, a dangerous disguise designed to hide the real content of their discourse, which is communitarian, non-universal, in other words, Jewish and American. In 2011, Badiou teamed up with the journalist Eric Azan to denounce once again those intellectuals who worry about the new anti-Semitism in a little book titled, tellingly, Antisemitisme partout aujourd'hui en France, so Anti-Semitism everywhere today in France, a clearly ironic title given that their goal is to show that there is no anti-Semitism in France. Here, Badiou and Azan blithely dismissed the gravity of the attacks against Jews, but their real motivation is to defend themselves, which is to say the French far left, against charges of aiding and abetting the criminals with their anti-Zionist rhetoric. Like Ramadan and Segret, Badiou and Azan attack the familiar targets, Finkelkraut, Lanzmann, Glucksmann, BHL, etc., most of whom they point out come from the left themselves, their political credentials enabling them to denounce those on the farther left with more credibility. Badiou and Azan resort to the same sort of reasoning as Ramadan and Segret. On the one hand, discussion of anti-Semitism in France serves to distract from Israel's repressive policies in the West Bank, as Ramadan would have it. On the other, Israel itself serves as a distraction from the even more sinister designs of the United States, as Segret maintains. In both cases, these intellectuals commit the crime of violating universalism because of their pro-Jewish positions. Badiou had already elaborated a similar critique in a 2005 work, Circonstance 3, subtitled Portée du mot juif, Meanings of the Word Jew. Really a collection of essays dating back to the 1980s, to which an essay by someone named Cécile Winter has been appended. It's here that we start to see the larger philosophical import of Badiou's universalism. In this bizarre and troubling book, Badiou maintains that anti-Semitism should not be examined separately from other racisms, for to do so places, I quote, the word Jew and the community that lays claim to it in a paradigmatic position in relation to the field of values, cultural hierarchies, or consideration by the politics of states, end of quote. He means by this kind of tortured syntax that any attempt to say that the persecution of Jews is unique or not the same as racism against blacks or Arabs commits the sin of, according to a single community, the Jewish community, a paradigmatic or transcendental significance, which is a violation of universalism. Badiou opposes any identitary predicate, that's his term, any kind of label attached to people or to states, but the Nazi experience has made Jewish identity particularly toxic. According to Badiou's logic, Hitler has forever tainted the word Jew and made it dangerous to use as a marker of group belonging. Hence, and I'm not exaggerating, the Jews who identify overtly as Jews become Nazis because they are using a word that Hitler used. In the text signed Cécile Winter, included in Badiou's book, the word Jew is referred to as, I quote, the master signifier of the new Aryans. Winter, who proclaims her own Jewishness by disavowing it, thus becomes one in a long line of what Badiou labels real Jews, along with Azan and Segret, whose Jewish identity helps legitimate Badiou's attack on Jewish identity. Note Badiou's hypocrisy in proudly naming his co-authors as Jews when it serves his purposes, despite his supposed hostility to all identity labels. All identity distinctions, all community formations, and all national allegiances become suspect in Badiou's extreme version of universalism. Of all the nations in the world, however, Israel is the only one that Badiou calls out for its nationalism, just as the Jews are the only people whom he faults for communitarianism. This is because, like St. Paul, Badiou makes the Jews into a metaphor both of what the universal should be, as well as of all that the universal is not. I quote Badiou, "We will attempt to come to an accord by diverse routes on a destiny of the word Jew whose meaning is universal." As in his preface to Segret, Badiou accomplishes this redefinition of the Jew by splitting the real Jews, the ethical or spiritual or universal Jews, from the false or ethnic or particularist Jews. This is the same procedure that Robert talked about in Isaac Deutscher earlier. Only those Jews who disavow Jewishness, whether national or ethnic or religious, are universal Jews, according to Badiou. And in this camp, he places Spinoza, Marx, and Freud. In the other camp, he puts the entire state of Israel, which becomes, in the title of the first chapter of his book, Le pays du monde où il y a le moins de juifs, so the country in the world where there are the fewest Jews. Badiou had already developed what I see as the essence of his thinking on the Jews and universalism in his 1997 book, St. Paul, The Foundations of Universalism, which, unlike the book on anti-Semitism, is widely discussed in academic circles. Badiou makes it clear from the start of the St. Paul book that his motivation in turning to ancient Christianity lies not in the properly Christian religious dimension of Paul's teaching, which he dismisses as a mere fable, but rather in the resonance of what Paul had to say about the Jews and universalism for contemporary France. He locates the essence of Paul's teaching in his famous statement of religious universalism. There is neither Jew nor Greek. There is neither slave nor free. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's Galatians 3:28. Indeed, Badiou's entire book can be understood as a gloss on this statement, which he interprets as announcing the existence of a new kind of subject, a subject devoid of all identity, except that made possible through a single event, the resurrection of Christ. According to Badiou, just as Paul places the concreteness of Jewish law, engraved in stone and manifest in physical signs like circumcision, with the abstractness of Christian law based on faith alone, so too does he create a subject who transcends the tribal, ethnic, and national identity of the Jews, or any kind of terrestrial determination whatsoever, including class and gender. Badiou explains that this is the basis of universalism both in Paul's time and our own. Whereas the Jews had tied truth to the law, which Badiou claims was only ever particular or applicable to the Jews, Paul makes truth available to all believers. I quote Badiou, Paul's unprecedented move is to shield truth from communitarian influence, whether it be of a people, of a city, of an empire, of a territory, or of a social class, end of quote. Paul, in other words, frees truth from the communitarianism of the Jews. But whereas for Paul, this meant freedom from Jewish law, for the radical French philosopher, freedom means overcoming nationalism and capitalism and identity politics, which of course are all still associated for Badiou with the Jews. One of the many outrageous features of Badiou's discourse is that he presents himself as a Philosemite. In Meanings of the Word Jew, he says he wants to protect the Jews from themselves. I quote Badiou, "A goy says it with passion, saving the name of the Jews is essential because it is a question of his own conceptual and active determination," end of quote. This saving gesture involves detaching the Jews from their Jewish identity, because all identity, but especially Jewish identity, is inherently fascistic. Now, there are many ways to critique this reappropriation of the language of universalism by the radical left. One can show its internal hypocrisy, its fallacious logic, its ideological affinities with more blatant forms of anti-Semitism, and I've tried to gesture in all of those directions here. In the remaining few minutes, however, I want to critique it from a different angle, by showing that the rigid opposition between the universal and the particular, espoused by Badiou and his followers, is predicated on a misunderstanding of universalism, both in St. Paul and in French political history. For the St. Paul part, I want to rely on Badiou's most eloquent opponent, Éric Marty, a French literature scholar whose work is only now beginning to be translated into English, and a collection of his essays is about to be published by Indiana University Press next year. In Brief Journey to Jerusalem, Marty asks why French intellectuals have taken the lead in denouncing Israel as a racist imperialist state. The answer, according to Marty, lies in the clash between two types of universalism, or rather in the inability of French universalists like Badiou to understand other forms of universalism, including especially the Jewish form. How, Badiou and his ilk ask, can there be a universal belonging to a single people? This seems like a contradiction in terms, except I would point out in the case of French universalism. Does not the notion of Jewish election preclude the universal by binding salvation to a particular group? As we've seen, Badiou seems to think so, and this represents the primary reason he looks to Paul as a model, for it was Paul who sought to overcome the election of the Jews by making salvation available to all through Christ. Badiou thus seeks to perform the laïque equivalent of Paul's gesture of religious supersession. But this, according to Marty, constitutes a misreading of Paul, for Paul always saw himself as a Jew and always thought that salvation came through the Jews. For Paul, the sacrifice of Christ was a repetition of the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, an event that Badiou passes over in his attempt to make the word Jew devoid of any other meaning beside the racist one Hitler attached to it. Paul said that there is neither Jew nor Greek, but he also said immediately after this, "And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise." As Marty explains, the universality declared by Paul is, I quote, in no manner the bourgeois declaration of the rights of man, end of quote, nor is it the declaration that the abstract individual, devoid of all particularity, would be, I quote Marty again, the measure or standard of the universal. Paul, moreover, did not renounce his belonging to a particular people. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin, Paul wrote in the Epistle to the Romans. As Marty explains, Jews, including Paul, have their own version of the universal that gets passed through the singularity, the particularity of a people. I'd like to suggest, by way of conclusion, that a similar notion of the universal, one that is not rigidly opposed to the particular, can also be found within the French intellectual tradition. In the book I'm currently writing on French universalism and the Jews, I argue that French universalism has a history, and one that has always taken shape in relation to the Jewish minority in France. I show that it was really during the Dreyfus Affair and its aftermath that the battle lines between the universal and the particular hardened into the fundamentally opposed camps we know them as today. The 1905 separation of church and state in France, a consolidation of the victory of the Dreyfusards over the right, helped instantiate an exaggerated Jacobin form of universalism, a vision of a secular public sphere that could not accommodate minority or religious or ethnic identities. Secularism, or laïcité, came to equal the absence of religion or ethnicity. But prior to the Dreyfus Affair, this was not, or not always, the case. In the 19th century, secularism meant the equal treatment of France's three major religions, Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, by the state. It was according to this logic that the government sponsored religious schools and paid the salaries of clergy, including after 1831 rabbis, until 1905. This was not a contradiction of universalism, but rather its fullest implementation, because the goal was to treat the religions fairly, not to banish them to the private realm. The notion of universal equality was not predicated on the absence of ethnic or religious particularity. While it's true that throughout the 19th century, a strong current of discourse demanded of the Jews that they assimilate or regenerate in the language of the day, it's also true that an opposing current was far more sanguine about Jewish difference. Before the outbreak of racist, nationalist anti-Semitism in the 1880s, Jewish composers like Meyerbeer and Halevi, Jewish jurists like Adolphe Crémieux, and Jewish actresses like Rachel Félix staked out positions in the French public sphere while boldly, publicly proclaiming their Jewishness. Their Jewishness was not seen as a liability, as an obstacle to Frenchness, something to be glossed over or swept under the rug. Indeed, the two identities, the Jewish particular and the French universal, were seen to go hand in hand. My point in this detour through French history is to suggest that the universal and the particular have not always been as opposed as Badiou and his ilk assume them to be. There have always been ways of moving beyond the binary opposition that allows for Jewish particularity to persist even within a French universalist context. I'll conclude with a reference to another far-left theorist, Jean-Claude Milner, a sparring partner of Badiou and occasional co-author, who offers a compelling critique of Badiou's hostility to Jewish particularity. Milner suggests in his book, Le Juif de Savoir, The Jew of Knowledge, that we distinguish between what he calls the easy universal of Badiou, a universal modeled on St. Paul, on supersessionism, on the repression of all forms of minority particularity, and a more difficult universal, one derived from particularity, and that takes difference into account, indeed that seeks in difference the ground for a more inclusive form of universality. Not only is the time ripe for the thinking through of the difficult universal, Milner tells us, but the return of the name of the Jew obliges us to such a thinking through. Thank you.
I am regretful that there is no time for debate, because I would have a lot of remarks on your analysis and all the authors you quoted Now we have Steve Baum, who is a psychologist and editor of a journal for the study of anti-Semitism. He's the author of Anti-Semitism Explained, Psychology of Genocide, and with Stephen Jacobs and Florette Cohen, co-editor of North American Anti-Semitism. His lecture, They Hated Me Before I Was Born, Anti-Semitic and Anti-Israeli Belief, transmission.
Thank you, Shmuel. My name's Steve Baum. I'm a psychologist from Albuquerque, wherever that is. And the reason I titled this so was that it's about 10 years ago. I see Helen Sharps in the audience next to Leslie Klaff, JSA associate editor. But about 10, 15 years ago, I think it was at Holy Blossom in Toronto, we saw Elie Wiesel. And he gave a lecture. It was very compelling. And at one point, he put his hands down in frustration and said, "They hated me before I was born." Now, I don't know why that stuck out, but it does. And I wanted to answer it a little bit by doing research in psychology for the next 15 years. I know it takes a while for me to put papers together. I do want to dedicate this, as everybody else did, to Dr. Wistrick's work and Yehuda Bauer, who I saw yesterday. I'm not seeing him today, for starting the journal. Henri Zucker, who is in New York City, but I talked to over the phone because his early papers were instrumental, from Hebrew University. Leon Volovoci, am I pronouncing that wrong? Leon's work was also helpful to me on Romanian stereotypes. It's also subtitled, "The Zionists Are Our Misfortune." And what you are seeing, for those of you who ever doubted it, though I'm sure everybody in this room, nobody ever doubted it, that you don't need actual Jews or actual Israelis in order to hate them. The highest... on the Pew 2008 poll, the highest incidence of anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli beliefs were coming from Jordan, who has been Judenrein since 1923, when Winston Churchill helped put through the law that prevented Jews from being citizens of Jordan. So it's, and it hovers around in Muslim nations from about 80% to about 100%. If you know the statistics, there are hardly any Jews left in Muslim nations at all. So it underscores for me that this is a psychological phenomena. This is the work of psychologists, and if any of the student-looking people in the room are in psychology, please contact me. Lots of work needs to be done because it's not based on reality. Anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism has nothing to do with real Jews or real Israelis. Very hard concept for me to get through every so often to myself. Anticipating also Robert Wistrick, who in his last book said, there is no more, or we're wasting our time with terminology regarding talking about racism or talking about Christian anti-Semitism. We should really need a new language that involves neo-Marxism, Islamism, and anti-global language. In my research, too, the language has been almost identical for anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and you're seeing the exact same tropes. In case you were wondering, the exact same stereotypes. There is actually almost nothing new. There are variations, like a conceptual peg, of 6 or 7 main stereotypical ideas. Protocols of the Elders of Zion, of course, being the most current or popular or modern one, but everything else is there in place as well. Jews as money grubbing people, Jews, Israelis as money grubbing, on and on it goes, undermining everything good and Christian, or in this case Muslim, on the planet. Human rights, of course, are having a field day with this. I don't know if you know the origin of this. Apparently, according to David Meyer Levy, the Yasser Arafat sought the help of for public relations from Vietnamese General Giap, G-I-A-P, and who told him the following: stop talking about annihilation of Israel, turn your terror campaigns to the struggle for human rights. And as you've seen, a proliferation and the changes since the 1970s to now what we're seeing, which is it's all about human rights and Israel usurping Palestinian rights, just like everybody else that they're entitled to. Now, Stephen Cohen, who is a British leftist, he caught it years ago when he distanced himself from the rest of the leftists by saying, his definition of the anti-Semitism on the left was the following: it makes attributes of world power to Zionists, and holds all Jews responsible for everything that was wrong on a global scale. Now, what I did is I started looking for, to try to follow the money on this a little bit, and looking for why Muslim student associations are so good at getting their message out, and Jewish groups are not. And it's incredibly hard to find. I don't work for the tax departments, but even if I did, I'm sure it would still be incredibly hard to find. But in essence, there's one or two main concepts of this, which are they have an electrifying message. Poor, for lack of a better word, innocents, who are struggling just to have their own land and have their rights met, is a very, very powerful message. And I'll talk about that particular narrative in one more minute. I want to suggest a couple things. There's been research, by the way, and nobody listens to the psychology research. I'm not passing around an article of mine. Okay, if you get a chance, and there's abstracts outside. I'm not the only one who's doing some research in this. Florette Cohn is doing research at, where's Florette? Staten Island. And it follows Kaplan and Small's study. But I did research to ask 100 Muslims why do you hate Israel? Why do you hate Jews? We had all sorts of responses. And then there's statistically a way of separating out the anti-Semitism from the anti-Israeli items. And statistically, there was still a moderate correlation between hating Jews, even if you factored out everything about Israel for Muslims. With more, I know we don't believe it, but there are some liberal Muslims, and when the more liberal Muslims were not as distinct that way. Bottom line on it is, underneath, you could make a compelling case, at least statistically, underneath the anti-Israeli sentiment is anti-Semitism. Now, what do the polls say? And I want to tell you that the latest, of course, being Anti-Defamation League, was a little bit low on this. I don't see Manfred Gerstenfeld in the audience, but he will probably concur. Greenspan did a study in 2011 of 1,000+ people, of Palestinians only in that study. 80% were calling for the destruction of Israel. But even more compelling is how strange the ideas float. So you have a couple ideas here. One is there's money being funded to get the message out and repeat it over and over, which is the basic concept of propaganda and why it works. The second is that they got a great message. It may not be an accurate message, it may not be true, but it doesn't take much. Here's a fascinating study, I thought, from Gallup poll back in 2001. U.S. population now, the Brits, you don't have to feel cocky because you're not much better in this even, or the French. Psychic healings, the number of people who believed in psychic healings, 54% of a group studied would believe that psychic healings are absolutely accurate. 50% believe in ESP. Everybody has some experiences sometimes. 42% believe in the validity of haunted houses, and 48% have believed that an extraterrestrial has visited Earth at different points in their lives. Now, I put that against the ADL survey from 2008, and you have the percentage of population that thinks that Jews have too much power and potentially could take over the planet. Spain, 76% of the population, that again, 22% higher than the psychic healing and the ESP believers. Hungary, 59%. Poland, 54%, and it goes on and on. And I want to point that up because you're not talking about thoughtful beliefs. Now, one of the things you'll come to understand is that these are widespread beliefs, and widespread doesn't mean that they are accurate. But people house these, and people have them for years. And I'm thinking of, and I apologize because I can't remember whose book I just read it in, Ali Hirsi, Ayaan Ali Hirsi, the Dutch parliamentarian, right? She was sitting in a cafe speaking to a woman, and her grandmother had always told her that Jews were evil and they were devil people. And till the friend across the way said, you know, we're here in Amsterdam and you're in the Jewish neighborhood, and these people who are serving you are probably all Jewish. She went, huh? And she was in her 20s, 25 probably at the time. But that's the way this stuff travels. It sits in a thoughtless container until somebody stirs it up, and if you're lucky, gets to correct it. If you're totally overwhelmed, join the club. Carolyn Glick, all aspects of Jewish life are under attack. And they have been since the year 2000 to 2005. Beginning with the Second Intifada, it's been going full blast. There's attacks in academia. I had, if that's getting passed around, maybe it's not, but there's a list. It's not only sort of like the BDS movement on college campuses. We're talking about, if you pick up all the academic journals and go through them, you'll start seeing articles critical of Israel, pro-Palestinian in the content, and we're talking, and what's shocking to me, these are in medicine. These are in psychology. These are not political journals with a clear-cut bias. There was, it was just out in the mainstream. They were in sociology. They were in every aspect of academia. Versus about 10 Jewish journals or Jewish-leaning journals, mine being number 9, Mideast Forum and Damn Pites being number 8. Not even talking about Patterns of Prejudice, which tends to be anti-Zionistic but pro-Jewish at times. So what is, there's psychological mechanisms that are going on and have been for a while. I just want to talk to you and introduce the concepts, a couple quick concepts. There's a reason psychologically, this is an area called heuristics, and it means the psychology of mental shortcuts. Now, signs and slogans that you'll see on college campuses, Israel is an apartheid state, the reason they stick in is because that you've heard it before, or seen it before, or seen or heard something like it before. Once you've heard something once and it's repeated, you have what's called a confirmation bias, and this is all for the students in social cognition research. But it goes on. If you there's something called a Polish potato chip study that I came across. Somebody got a master's degree on this. This is impressive. It's about 8 years ago, and in Poland, at one of the universities, they went through and grabbed 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, gave them bags of potato chips. One bag of potato chips was from, was it Holland? Second bag was from Holland, couldn't have been Belgium, they're too close. Holland, there's a second group from, and please forgive me on this, assume it's France. And the third one had a Jewish star on it. They asked the children which chips tasted better. The Dutch chips tasted best. Maybe it was Polish chips first. Polish chips tasted best, followed by the Dutch chips. The least tasty chips, of course, were the ones with a Jewish star on them. All chips were the same. That's the type of research that we are needing to see. And so where do kids who are 5 years old, 8 years old learn this? And the answer is everywhere. It's everywhere. They hear it in bits and pieces at home. A cousin saying it on the TV set. How am I doing? 5 more minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes left? Yeah, ooh, I thought it'd be fast. Okay. All right, then let me tell you a couple things more. Narrative development. Also, there's also a reason why the Jewish messages or the Israeli messages aren't as powerful, because we have different ideas about what is morally right or wrong, or things we believe in. So, things like victimization. They're at a much higher level than, say, Jews don't deserve the treatment they're getting. So as long as there are different levels of narrative and moral development, that's where we need to focus on, and that's what we need to move towards. And until you have counter, for lack of a better word, counter propaganda out there where Jews are attacking as well as the Muslim messages, we're not going to get equal footing on any kind of grounds. Just to summarize also and conclude, this is 1/24 of 0.5% of the population, Israel, living on 1 out of 520th square miles of Arab land. So the question becomes, how can Jews ever hope to get their message out or get their needs known the same way? And the answer is, we're going to have to do a propaganda campaign almost as good as theirs has been for the last few years. And that is why you're feeling tense, and that is why you're being overwhelmed at times, because the assaults are there, they're simple, and they're going on, they're an ongoing process. Let me just finish up here with one more idea. And that is, there's a special report, by the way, I don't know if you ever know about this. The UN has they used Arab scholars for this, and it's the Arab Development Report in 2002, and they repeat the reports every year. These are considered the best, most unbiased reports. They have never had a report. They talk about at least in the 2002, they talk about a deficit, a freedom deficit in education in Arab cultures that is massive, including women, etc., and they have never blamed Israel in that report. There's no mention of anything Israeli, there's no mention of anything of Jews. But I'm sure that report doesn't get talked about very much. So I'm going to leave you with the idea that there are things to do psychologically, we just got to start doing them. Thank you.
We have to finish? Okay, I'm sorry because there is a concert this evening, and I'm sorry there is no debate on this very interesting lectures. Have a good evening.